I'm Isabella and you're listening to Zeno. Each month I have conversations with people from all walks of life about their personal stories of home, identity and the search for belonging. I'm joined today by Valerie. Valerie is an educational psychologist from Lima, Peru, living in London since 2015. Most of her work has been in a variety of higher education contexts, from teacher training for the Peruvian Ministry of Education to designing learning courses with universities in the UK. She's interested in intercultural education, decolonising knowledge, human rights, and inclusive design. Welcome, Valerie.
Hi. Hi,
It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me here.
How do you answer the question, where are you from? And when you answer that question, what truths do you think are missing from the answer?
Hi, that's a really good question. I didn't feel in the realm of otherness as much as I've experienced since I've moved to London. Particularly because I'm constantly challenged by the fact that you don't look Peruvian. No, that's more what I get all the time. And now what I'm trying to explain to myself as I'm unpacking my intersectionality is that I come from Lima. I come from a sense of urban Peruvianness and still tainted by colonialism. So I've been exposed and the ways I feel and think are aligned with a realm of traditions from the native nations, indigenous nations in Peru, and also the migration from different cultures like Chinese, Spanish, Japanese, Arabic, Jewish. Peru is incredibly multicultural. And this urban Peruvianness, like there's this balance that exists that is very strange because I learned how to dance Afro-Peruvian music when I was in school. No, I learned how to play the pan flute, the Andean pan flute. But I was never taught to think that it wasn't my ancestors who created these traditions. It's actually other people's ancestors. And it's very difficult to explain what I have inside and my ways of feeling and thinking are not that white.
Right. And you moved to London in 2015. It seems like this question of where are you from hasn't really become maybe negative until you were in the UK. Is that right?
Yes, it was, well, ignorance is bliss, no? As we know. So living in the Lima bubble, I did notice things like in some contexts I might not have been that welcomed, but I always thought it had more to do with being a woman, actually.
Oh, really?
Than my skin color or how I looked or my name. It's not easy being Valerie Watson. Like my dad prepared me, like everyone's going to make fun. Chances are someone's going to make fun of you. Get ready. And I just was not aware. I was not questioning how I could be perceived or how I was perceiving others and how much of that perception was actually influenced by things that I had been taught. So, for example, there's, I think, in Lima, and this is why at the beginning I said, like, tainted by colonialism, because there's this feeling that if you are Peruvian, you're entitled to all these traditions.
Right.
But I don't think that's true. It's not. I'm really proud of having grown up in such a multicultural context, but I'm not Quechua, and I am not from the Amazon. And I have so much respect for these communities, that it's really difficult to think that I had not reflected properly about all of that until I got here and everyone was like, but you don't look Peruvian. Yeah, when you're questioned like that, they're questioning your identity, because if I'm not Peruvian, then what am I?
Right.
No?
It seems like that question, where are you from, and, oh, but you don't look Peruvian, motivated you to go on this entire journey to reflect on why were they even perceiving you as such, because you didn't perceive yourself in that way.
Exactly. And also feeling really strongly how racism works. I don't want to say at all that I'm a victim. I don't get the violence that comes with racism. And I understand now that's privilege. But I understand what's behind it better. This lack of acknowledgement that we are more inside and that we're way more complex and we carry a history, and trying to take this stereotypical shortcut that if you look like this or that, then you have to be this or that. And I'm not only thinking about racism, but also body shaming and all these other layers of intersectionality that come with being a woman, being perceived in a certain way and growing up with a lot of pressure to be and act a certain way.
It's interesting what you say about this inability for people to acknowledge the fact that you are more than what you are visually. I'm reading Amin Maalouf's book, In the Name of Identity, at the moment. And I mean, his perspective is he's Lebanese, but Christian Lebanese. And because of the French, speaks French and Arabic. And he talks about how you can't possibly separate the parts of your identity. They all mingle together in one, you know. It's like that question of, do you feel more Arab or do you feel more French? And he talks about this in a very tongue-in-cheek way. It's like, I could never tell you I am more French or more Arabic. I am all of these things. I have my Christian heritage. I have these languages. I have French literature, Lebanese literature, you know, all of these experiences and things that have touched you in your life come together in this, he calls it a tapestry that's very tightly woven together. And it seems like often with the question, where are you from? Or like, oh, you don't look Peruvian. It doesn't acknowledge this fact that you are a very complex person. We're all very complex and our identity is more of a tapestry than one singular affiliation to something.
And it's also such a limiting shortcut, no? This kind of stereotypical thinking, or just allowing our brains to take the shortcut, because we're so much more, no? So, for example, I was speaking with my wife the other week, thinking, you know, sometimes we fantasize, like the day we leave London. and one of the things I was telling her was that I will always, whenever I look back to the time I lived in London, one of the things I'm going to be the most grateful for is having Muslim friends.
Mm.
And having had the chance to talk about faith, love, family, prayer. I'm not particularly a religious person, but again, based on colonialism, there was the Inquisition, so I was raised Catholic, not extremely, but I understand spirituality. And having been able to understand that we feel the same, although we're from different cultures, and that whenever I pray or some sort of prayer, I wish good for everyone, and I wish love for everyone that needs love. And my Muslim friends are doing the exact same thing. And I find that incredibly powerful, that level of connection that once you take out how we look, the colors, the language, at the end of the day, when we go home and we're about to sleep, we're all praying and thinking positive thoughts for humankind. No, that's, well, not everyone.
You hope so. You hope people are doing that.
Yes, across cultures at least.
Just for context as well, we met through Enroll Yourself, and a beautiful, beautiful community online and in person. And you've just completed actually your learning marathon, Education for Liberation, is that right?
Yes.
Can you talk to me about your question, what your learning question is, and your experience and what your kind of key takeaways were?
Yes. I've loved this experience. It's been transformational. I wonder if it's also the pandemic context, the fact that we were a group of women, which also enables other types of conversations and reflection, no? This sense of belonging as a group. But, well, my question, the theme of the marathon was education for liberation. And my question was, and perhaps is, how can my education serve our liberation? And my starting point was understanding what I meant by my education. So understanding my education as my lived experiences of learning that can go, so this is how I organized it in my mind. I was clearly taught this and that by someone, all the way to, because of my sense of agency, I was able to learn this. And in the middle, there's schooling, my parents, my grandma, my brothers and sisters, my friends, my first working experiences, university. There's like it's a mix of learning experiences. Then I think all of them are my education. And opening that question also meant understanding the privilege of going to a private school in Lima, Peru, a British private school. Also understanding my lack of awareness with native traditions as I was growing up, although we cherished them at school. My British school, 4 houses. We had, competitions, inter-houses. One of the competitions was folklore dancing, like the houses organized to dance typical Peruvian dances. Or, we were in 5th grade, 4th grade, so 9, 10. You would get like 100 students in the year dancing Afro-Peruvian music. It was incredible, no? It was incredible to get this mix, or even through literature, reading about our history, reading national Peruvian authors. and understanding it. But from a very academic perspective, I'd say, more than understanding and reflecting about how that makes up for society, the society I was growing up in. It wasn't until university that I was able to see that. I now say I was very lucky to go to the university I went to because it was focused on humanities. It's like they say, most left-wing Peruvians come from here. Because you do your reality check there. That's it. It invites you to do your reality check and to share lived experiences with students that come from across the country. And I also had the chance to work years later in Beca 18, the Peruvian scholarships for talented students in the poorest areas of the country. And that also was incredible. What an incredible experience to meet so many motivated students from different contexts with different traditions that were just coming to uni to be. And seeing them blossom, and open up and find ways to bring in who they were. It was incredibly inspiring. So thinking about all of this, it's like, okay, so I worked with my student that was from the Amazon and he loved dancing. And I know that kind of dances, but those are that's his dance. It's not my dance, And acknowledging that later on as what a privilege to have shared so closely and even participated of these cultures that are not really mine, but I've been able to participate. And thinking about this my education and reflecting on it just made me feel freer too. So there's this rhetoric in the sense that as I started reflecting on how I learned and my education, I felt more like me and also more clear in saying what is mine and what isn't. And that's, for example, how we came up with this term urban Peruvianness, where everything's mixed and imbalanced, but it's not particularly just one thing.
That's so fascinating. It's very, very multi-layered. It's multi-generational. And I wonder, you touch on colonialism a lot here, and obviously that's very inherent in the Peruvian experience. It seems like you're conscious of how that has impacted Peruvian society and how that's impacted people. And it seems like even the idea that this is mine, this is yours, is, if anything, a colonial idea. I own this land, I own this gold, this is our language. The sense of ownership, if anything, is a very colonial idea. And it sounds like you were very exposed to the grey areas presented to you through indigenous culture, where there's no sense of ownership. If anything, there's this reverence for what is not ours, but we can be present for it. So the idea of like Pachamama, Mother Nature.
And even like traditional dances, Huayño, for example, which is traditional from some Andean areas. It's a dance that you dance with your mates in groups with a choreography that you start repeating, but you just join. If you show up, you can dance. That's how it works. And for example, here in London, there's a group of Peruvians dancing, celebrating the 200 years of independence. They're not practicing. They're not really practicing that much because the logic is there's 2-3 steps and then we get together and we will enjoy it and we will make it up as we go. Because that's how traditionally it works. It works in the community. You don't need to overthink it, overdo it. The important part is you come to share. And we all enjoy it. And with like a playful way of seeing things. And it's also really interesting because I don't consider myself particularly a good dancer, but the joy I get from music and dancing, it's something that lives in this urban Peruvianness. From cumbia to Afro-Peruvian music, to classic criollo songs. I can cry sometimes, like I feel them. It's very powerful. And understanding how grateful I am with all these cultures that allow me to feel like this. That's the thing that has made me aware of how colonialism is embedded in my country. In education, in politics, in economics, in human development, lawmaking, in everything that makes up this Peruvianness.
It shaped the narrative across many different areas of public life and personal life as well. You also shared with me Alienación by Ribeyro, right?
Yes.
This is a plug-in to read that. Fascinating. And that story, I'd love to talk to you about how you connected with that story personally. So from what I understood, you have this protagonist who is Limeño, but of a lower, quote, lower social class. He is darker skinned and he wants to become American. He wants to become a Yankee from Philadelphia. And it has this kind of surrealist feeling to it. But there's this sense that one can never become the idealized fiction, which is the American ideal.
That story, I loved Ribeyro. I think one of the best things I got from my literature teachers at school was the authors and the selection of material. No, I had a very critical human, that teacher that wanted us to do this reality check in our British school for ladies. No, so that was a very interesting way to expose us to other perspectives in a context that we could still relate with because we were in Lima. But I think I was 13 or 12 when I read the story, and I remember the story goes like the character is Roberto Lopez, and at the end of the book he's Bobby Lopez, no, of the story, because it makes him sound more American too, or as he would say, no, like whiter, which was the aim of his life plan or his biggest desire to stop being called names or being considered this and that because of his skin color, which is something that happens every day in urban Peru. No, there's a lot of discrimination. And that was the first time I felt frustration, I think, in relation to this context, because I could feel that he was trying to do something impossible because that was not who he was. No, and I felt that he hated himself. And that was incredibly moving for me. I was very young too and sensitive, but it made me think about, again, all these things that we are inside. Maybe it was one of the first times I thought about this. I thought like, hey, Bobby, look, now he's hardworking. He's willing to do anything for his dreams. He cares about his friends. He's worth love. His value is humongous. But he still feels, because of this horrible context, that he needs to do more and he needs to be someone else. And he's never going to be that someone else also, no? Because so much frustration. I remember asking my teacher, why was he trying? Why? He was trying to explain me. He is doing what in his mind and within his power is what he thinks he can control, no? Which is a direct link with appearance based on race and becoming more Americanized. I just found it was sad. And now, Ribeyro, particularly, all of his stories are melancholic. Like that's one of the themes. Because Lima is actually a very melancholic city too. It's grey most of the time, not that different from London. And there's a lot of violence and aggression. At the same time, you play a song and everyone and anyone will start dancing. There's this togetherness. At the same time, there are these factions, no? Groups that almost never intersect and don't relate to each other. I keep thinking about Bobby Lopez many, many times, especially because of how, well, the story ends.
That story, I'm so grateful that you shared it with me as well. The shocking part of it is it seems to be absolutely clear to the reader that no one can ever change their physicality to become a white American. It seems like it's commenting on the American hegemony influence, the neoliberal post-colonial influence. And in that way, these powers have the ability to affect how one sees oneself, which is why you have this sense of self-hatred among minority groups. Yeah, any kind of ethnic or religious minority. And it's amazing that you had such a powerful reckoning with that at such a young age, like 13. To be thinking about these ideas, it seems like it really was formative for you and how you wanted to approach your life and your work.
I'm an error in the matrix, I think. Because I'm not an heir of the post-colonial elite. My family's migrated to Peru after that in different conditions. And my dad was doing well. He had his own business when I was growing up. But in the early 90s, in Fujimori's government, 1992, a lot of companies went bankrupt because he changed the system. He actually took power and there was a whole change in the economic system and a lot of families lost their money. So I ended up being part of a generation where in my school, until a couple of years before me, most girls would have come from wealthy families. But in my year, there was a big group of us that didn't have any money. By the time we were 7, our families were struggling. So, of course, there were still the posh ones, that have yachts and whatnot. But there was also this, I don't feel like I belong here because I don't have money. And I'm not posh, and I'm not going to Disneyland, and I'm not doing this and that. I'm still here. No, there's a lot of things I can take away from being here, but I'm clearly, so that's what I felt like. I clearly don't belong with part of the people I'm expected to belong with, because it was so based on privilege. It was so based on what can you access, where do you go? And I just didn't fall into that. And at the same time, all the things that started happening and I started learning that made me feel human, connected, joy, things that make me feel joy, had nothing to do with this sort of like poshness, privileged life. It had more to do with thinking and feeling and listening and connecting. Even on my last year of school, I don't think I told you this, as we were preparing for our exams, for the IBEs, GCSEs, with a group of friends, we stopped like asking God, hey, good luck, like praying to do well in our exams. But there's in Peruvian popular culture, because Inquisition was so harsh and so strict in relation to you need to believe in the Virgin, you need to believe in the saints. But traditionally, native Peruvians believe in Pachamama, believe in the mountains, believe in the sun. There's this in-between types of beliefs that created other symbols for prayer, like El Señor de los Milagros, which is like the Lord of Miracles, and that's celebrated every October. And it's extremely strange because there's a parade even like carrying this symbol of Señor de los Milagros, and people are, even like proper Catholics, love El Señor de los Milagros. But it's more of a popular symbol than anything else. And back then, in that year of school, I learned about Sarita Colonia, who was a woman that died very young. And she's considered Almita Milagrosa, like a miraculous soul. And the premise is God is to be seen, I'm not the best human if I'm a thief, or if I have to work really hard, or if I'm someone struggling. God is not going to help me necessarily because I'm failing. But one of these miraculous souls, if I ask her for help, she will help me. And that made so much more sense to me in my mind. I still carry Sarita. Like I have her on my wallet all the time since I was 16, 17. Because that made way more sense to me. You pray to some spirit that you feel is gonna help you, and that's it. And you can do this type of praying based on however you pray, There's no right way. And you can use the symbols you want or no symbol, and as long as you feel protected, you keep going. And Sarita is one of these symbols that now is very popular, but you used to see her on taxis. And it's incredible because it comes from these gray areas between what was mandated through Inquisition and Catholicism and everything else that exists in Peruvian territory.
It was a natural thing that was created by people themselves to serve themselves, rather than something that was forced.
Exactly. It wasn't imposed.
I think one of the beautiful things I've noticed about Latin American countries is this reverence for the in-between, for the reverence for the grey area, you say. Because when you have indigenous cultures meeting Western cultures, and plus that urban Peruvianism, what happens is this mix and confluence of all these different ideas and ways of being. So it sounds like you really resonate with that in-between experience.
Yes, with all the in-betweens. And also, I think when I say gray area, more like the unknown, I think it's a gray area that has loads of shades, And sometimes when you come from a static culture, So let's say you are British from the north and you were always here and your family has always been here. You really think that the world can only exist in the way you've been brought up and the way you have organized your emotional world, or even if you have thought about your emotions or so, is the only thing there exists that is available and that is possible. But if you've had intercultural experiences and understand your own intersectionality, you actually have a wider approach to everything else because it's possible. And that's something I think about a lot because many times, for example, I was trained in psychology, so that helped. I think my emotional spectrum is not like black or white, it's just shades of gray. And in those shades of gray, I can have a lot of empathy for different things and connect with people in different ways. For example, with my wife, who's Spanish, sometimes she's like, I don't get it. Are you mad? And I'm like, I'm not mad. Like, there's 3 things I can be before being mad. No, and these layers of feeling and thinking that are way more complex than just one vision of the world, no, or just one way to do things.
Yeah, absolutely. That multitudinous approach of some Latin cultures is something that's I've really resonated with as well. Like, I think I've told you before, like when I was in Argentina, that was probably the place that I felt the most accepted for just at face value because I spoke Spanish. Like, that was it. Like, just the ability to connect with someone in someone else's language. I've taken the effort to learn your language and then eventually learn Castellano and learn the subtleties of that was enough for me to have for people to open their doors to me. Whereas in places and cultures where it is more singular and static, it's a completely different mindset, and people don't have the ability to just say, I accept you, because there are all these other barriers that need to be crossed before that acceptance happens.
In my experience in higher education, and also what I see that is happening right now in relation to lifelong learning and how everything's like competency-based training forever, and you have to pay and train and pay and train and pay forever, no? That's more or less what this capitalist system is telling us. But actually, what we need is reflection.
Absolutely.
That's the key thing. And if the CPD and universities and schools are not focused on that, then I get why there's so many people unschooling their kids, because the solutions for the problems that we're facing and the ones that we'll face in our lives come from our ability to take stock of our stuff and reflect on it. But it's so focused right now on standardization and measurements and exams. And if you get this grade, you can get to this university. And of course, a university, you need to pay like 10 years of your life, you're going to be paying this debt. And once you're finished at university, you might have not gotten any relevant experience or thinking that will help you deal with life and with the reality we're in right now.
Absolutely.
And that worries me a lot, if I'm very honest with you. And I don't see it stopping. And I'm really afraid that universities are already sort of destroyed and harmed to a point that there might be no return because of turning them for profit and creating pressures in academia to create money.
In that way, I'm very inspired and encouraged by things like Enroll Yourself. These spaces where they're slowly but surely and quietly challenging what we have here. But we spoke about this before, the idea that social mobility isn't real. It's like, social mobility is real if you can afford to go and do an MBA and also have a family at the same time as having a full job and doing the MBA.
Which is really not possible, no? When we look at it intersectionally, no, it's, okay, how do we understand social mobility? Okay, so, and whatever you imagine first, would that work the same way for a man and a woman? Or can you clearly see that the one that can rise in this mobility is a man, and the woman will need to help him and take care of all the other stuff he will not be able to take care of because he's going to be focused on the social mobility part of studying and working. And then what happens with that woman, no? And if you're a woman, how much more difficult is that for you? And if you're from a rural area, and if you're indigenous, and if you're black, and then we start
leveling, yeah.
Yes, going through for example, one of the biggest disappointments for me in relation to understanding where I come from is that people die in my country because of frosting season, like frostings in winter, because of lack of work, because of lack of food, because they don't have shelter. When my country is probably one of the richest countries in natural resources in the world. I think it's like Brazil, Peru. There's a few countries that have everything now. Peru is the second copper producer in the world or something like that. And silver and gold. And all of this mining that's happening is destroying communities and poisoning lakes and poisoning rivers. We still do not recognize in our legislation and our constitution the native nations as nations the fact that we're still discussing this is very colonial, no? It's like we never shook off this colonialism. Now we're here and everything's from everyone, like for everyone, which is a lie because some families inherited mining land.
And would never even dream about giving it up.
Exactly. And whenever you question something, and it's like, but the state is corrupt. I get it. I really do get it because there's narco traffic. It's very difficult to talk about sustainable development and governability in Peru and other countries in the region because of cocaine trafficking. There's always going to be someone that's going to say, I'm going to pay you this much money if you do this, or I'll kill your family. So corruption just debilitates the state a lot. And there's just no room publicly for this kind of conversations. Now, this is changing. Right now, my country is going through a really harsh time because we now have a new president and he's the first indigenous president we have.
Wow.
And he's from Cajamarca, he's not from Lima, and he's a rural school teacher. And there's a lot of conflict, because we have never reconciled all our differences. And also, we had terrorism in the 1980s and 1990s. So there's a lot of things politically now being lifted up and a lot of misunderstandings between people in the rural areas that were also threatened by terrorism. So there's a lot of anger, fear, misunderstanding. And between all of this, which is historical, we were going through an internal war period, there are the layers of the ones that are rural, the ones that are urban, the different indigenous communities, how we split land, how inequality works, what is sustainable, everything's together. So right now, for example, although I was really hopeful for change, more than anything, I'm like, just listen to each other. Every time I speak with someone, I'm just like, stop thinking that whatever you hear from someone, you have been wired to dislike. And just listen to the words. We need to reconcile all of this because there shouldn't be terrorism anymore. There shouldn't be any poverty. And we need to save the Amazon. I also really think Peru has a key role in protecting the world of a climate apocalypse. And they're doing nothing.
There has to be a consensus and an understanding in order to move forward together when there's so many different cultural groups.
And the first victims of climate crisis are the indigenous communities, are the indigenous nations. And they have no way of defending themselves unless everyone else has their back. And last year, 8 indigenous activists were murdered. I haven't seen any research and any investigation, nothing. And that tells you a lot about how the value of the life of an indigenous person that is trying to protect the world, which I find incredibly
disturbing.
It makes me afraid. It makes me also think that when I was growing up, I knew there was a lot of violence around me all the time. And for a period of time, I thought it had to do with being a woman. Now I just think there's aggression because there's oppression. And it just trickles down the pyramid of inequalities and discrimination and vulnerabilities and hurts everyone.
I want to touch on as well, this sense of personal responsibility. As you say, there's no space emotionally, physically, mentally for the state to take on these issues because of corruption or whatever else is happening. And then that increases this personal onus to do something about it. And you've told me about your British and your Spanish heritage, but also growing up in Peru. And it seems like there's this need to be hyper aware of your own ancestry in order to be able to speak with conviction about these things. And the sense of intergenerational guilt. And interestingly enough, I discovered that my ancestors on my dad's side, so they were Irish, Scottish, and travelled through to New Zealand and then settled there. And my great-great-grandfather was in the British Army and then arrived in New Zealand and started a logging company. And he actually cut down sacred trees revered by Maori people. And those trees then became part of the sails on British boats in the army. And I was shocked. And there's this sense of intergenerational guilt and shame that I feel, thinking my ancestors have basically profited off of the natural world that was so significant to this population of people. And it's a very, very unsettling feeling. And it does give this sense of responsibility. How can I repair that damage that was caused before I even existed? But I do still feel responsibility for how they conducted themselves at that time.
I understand. I can empathize with this a lot because I'm trying to shake off the guilt. If I think of myself, of being complex, of not feeling the way I was expected to feel many times, or having a wider spectrum of thinking and feeling, whatever. But I'm trying to see it now as power. Okay, all of this happened, my ancestors, and I find myself now aware, willing to unlearn. And yeah, I came in this color, but what can I do with what I have? And that also brings me back to my education. For example, one of the things I realized was my network in Lima is power. Now my network in London is part of my power. So more than trying to feel that I need to repair, it's impossible really to repair, no? And also we cannot dimension the consequences of our ancestors' acts. But what we can do is try to use the power we have now for social justice, to try to make evident that we're more inside and we have more in common, and that we all deserve respect and humanity.
Yeah.
Because I think that's the thing that hurts me. Like when I think about my ancestors, I really feel a lot of shame that I'm 100% sure they didn't think and feel that native Peruvians were as human as them, the people I've learned so much from. And these traditions, the traditions that make me me.
I feel that massively. Someone who I follow religiously is Gabor Mate, and he's a doctor who's written extensively on really interesting subjects. But he mentioned in a talk about an author that he read talking about colonialism, the psychology of colonialism. And he mentioned in order to colonize someone, in order to colonize a place, you must dehumanize that person to allow that to happen in yourself. Because if someone were to colonize another person but thought that person was just as valuable as they were, the dissonance is too much, right? It does not work physically, emotionally, psychologically, right? But if you say that person's less than you, that person's other, that person is not even human, that allows you to carry out that colonial project. And remnants of that mentality still persist today, and we're still unpacking that. I do want to point out this quote because I think it relates to your experience. And he starts the book, Amin Maalouf starts the book by talking about multifaceted identities being at the convergence of all these different things, whether it's urban Peruvianism or indigenous cultures, Quechua, and all these different things. And he says that people who see things in that way have a special role to play in forging links, eliminating misunderstandings, making some parties more reasonable and others less belligerent, smoothing out difficulties, seeking compromise. Their role is to act as bridges, go-betweens, mediators between the various communities and cultures. And that is precisely why their dilemma is so significant. If they themselves cannot sustain their multiple allegiances, if they are continually being pressed to take sides or ordered to stay within their own tribe, then all of us have reason to be uneasy about the way the world is going. I just think that encapsulates perfectly these different tensions. The need to acknowledge I'm Peruvian, but I'm not indigenous, but I have reverence for the indigenous cultures. This need to illustrate the extent of allegiance. But it feels like, from the way you describe it, it is moving towards that social justice narrative of solidarity more so than ownership of this is my belonging.
I do feel that once you're aware of how intersectional and complex you are better able to be a bridge because you can create more understanding or spot the misunderstandings and try to intervene and clarify. Now, for example, in Peru, and this is one of the things I think about constantly now, it's how I've been questioned all my life, because if I'm there, how I behave is not white enough. And then if I do what I want with my friends and, like my community, which is way more diverse, depending on the context, I might also be like the outsider, depending on how they see me. Not that, I need to try to make more evident that it's more the things that we share than the differences. And that sometimes is also exhausting, because it's being questioned all the time about where you actually belong and having to reframe all the time that you're complex and you're here and you have goodwill, and a lot of love, basically, to bring people together, because we need to be more aware of our capacity to love each other that's something we should be taught.
Absolutely.
In secondary school. Not as a hippie thing also, no, but we need to love nature, no? We need to start also with nature, humanity,
empathy,
animals, biology, yes, being alive. Closing your eyes and acknowledging your inner voice and what it's saying and listening to it, no? It's more complicated. But I don't know, it's getting there, no? I'm for example, way more comfortable now. If anyone tells me, like, I don't look Peruvian, I laugh and I leave. Like, I don't even care anymore. If I have 2 minutes, I will explain. No, you don't know, Peru is like this and that, immigration and this and that, blah, blah. I've lived there for 28 years. I am Peruvian. But I am not indigenous. No, I would make it very clear. But I'm not taking it personally anymore. Those kinds of questionings, I'm not taking them anymore. Because I have confirmed or solidified my identity. I'm more comfortable saying I'm a non-indigenous Peruvian, also a woman, also gay, because I'm many things.
You've already done the personal work needed to smooth things over with other people who wouldn't understand. You already have such a complex understanding of your own sense of self and how it fits into these wider narratives that you can then navigate these very simplistic questions.
I don't know if I can. I am extremely worried about the Amazon rainforest. I acknowledge that I have more power in Lima, or at least I'd have more connections. I'm not sure what to do, how to do it, how to bring people together. Now, those are still questions. But as I try to navigate them and solve them, I know the answer comes first from acknowledging all the humans involved in this problem. Because the power to solve something is going to come from the collective. And the collective power comes from loving each other, from believing that together is better than alone. But a lot of people don't see it. Their minds are wired to other everything else and anyone else and just try to function like that.
I want to touch on empathy and love and like what you're talking about in terms of connecting with people. It's very difficult. It feels like there's so much weight to every single conversation. And the code switching element of it is relevant as well. And I only learned about code switching very recently. For me, that was a massive light bulb moment. Like, wow, this is intersectionality at work. The ability to recognize the different cultural mores around you of the group that you might be in. Whether I was at boarding school, surrounded by people who are mostly fully British, or if I'm in my university where I'm surrounded by Americans, just the ability to be cognizant of these different cultural dynamics and then align myself with whatever is the most dominant form. And then through that process, understanding that now that I know how to align myself with whatever is that dominant cultural narrative happening in that space, to communicate these more nebulous ideas, like the idea of multiculturality in Latin America, how someone might perceive something differently to how you perceive it. It feels like there's so many different threads of narratives happening in these conversations, and it sounds like you're having to constantly do that in or every space that you're in, whether it's work or in London. It feels like there's so much weight on these conversations to communicate what needs to be said.
And communicating it in a way that is accessible. Half of the communication is getting the message across, no? And then praying for the other one to pick it up and go like, yes, I get it now. And it's really complex. I find I've never had so much difficulties to explain emotions and having this kind of abstract conversations than with British friends. Who I love, by the way. They're all fantastic, but it just shows me that some of these questions, they didn't ask themselves before, or nobody asked them about them before. And it's only when they are not feeling that well or a bit depressed, like when their mental health starts kicking in, that they also reflect about other things. I'm not saying this everyone, but it has happened in the last 6 years that I've come across this several times. And it's so incredible how, based on our lived experiences, we will look at things in a specific way. And unless there's an invitation that is non-threatening to listen to someone that thinks differently, the communication won't work. And there will be no chance of self-reflection, of inception, of leaving an idea and then leaving and letting people, grow, share, think about things a bit more, come back and build a friendship that is back and forth, thinking about important things and connecting more and more. it has a lot to do also with this resistance, I think. I can be very, very liberal and very open and perhaps very articulate, but I'm not indigenous. I would rather be listening to someone indigenous saying that stuff that is important. That's the kind of democratic view I have of where my country needs to get to. But in the realm of where I am, if I'm sure that I can present myself in a non-threatening kind of way, that also facilitates me saying some things or just leaving some ideas, a little bit less confrontational. And I wouldn't say it's code switching, but it is reality-based communication, like knowing when I can challenge things, when I can't, and when I also maybe need to just smile a little bit and be the friendly one that, I have this idea, we should all love each other, that starts questioning things from a different angle and leaves the conversation, not threatening privilege. Don't use the word privilege.
That's very interesting that you have that perspective, because there's this increasing debate around white fragility, which I think Robin DiAngelo started, which is important. But from what you know about psychology and from my personal experience of doing mental health support, people won't listen if they feel threatened or if they feel judged. Human beings want to feel like they're right and that they're virtuous. So it's almost like a dance, really, to try and create a space and a conversation where someone can come to a transformative realization on their own. And it has to be on their own or else it will never resonate. So it's very difficult to use words like privilege and white fragility, because although it's significant and it's true, it may not lead us to where we need to be in order to solve our problems collectively in time.
No, yes, because it is the truth. It is like undeniably truth. Like, let's look at it from any angle. It's truth. But just as we have been able to reflect about our ancestors and where we come from and how we're perceived in different contexts, most people haven't. Especially, I'd say, my white Peruvian fellas, most haven't. Just as I'm here today telling you, it wasn't my ancestors that taught me all these incredible things that make me feel alive and that I enjoy, but the ancestors of, native Peruvians. Most people I know have not reached that reflection. They feel entitled to Peruvian, not like, if I'm Peruvian, I'm entitled to all of this realm of cultures and traditions and dances and that because I'm Peruvian, without any reflection of, okay, but do you recognize that you're culturally different or that you're a bit more Western? How much do you appreciate actually these traditions and from Afro-Peruvians, from indigenous Peruvians? And it's difficult to open a conversation about that in a confrontational kind of way. I think talking about privilege and talking about inequality requires us more than ever to prepare the conversations, to actually set up a tone, prepare ourselves to introduce some topics without threatening the other person, but also holding that other person. Because as you've mentioned, guilt pops up. And once you think another person is trying to guilt trip you, boom, the wall of defense just goes up and the conversation is not going to flow. But if you prepare sometimes from your self-introduction of your own journey or building bridges, just perfect quote, the one you read, then once the bridge is there, it's easier to keep supporting the person into starting a reflection of their own. But that requires time, patience, arguments, being extremely careful of the words you're saying, how you're using them. But it can be transformational.
Absolutely. And all those elements that you mentioned, which are necessary for these conversations, is not readily available in our society, sadly.
We don't have time, no? Most of the time, we don't have time.
Yeah, but there are these spaces building, whether it's Enroll Yourself or the work that you're doing. And yeah, I'm excited. I think collectively we're getting there.
I hope so. Again, when we look at things intersectionally, it's still so complicated. I was chatting with a friend who's from Pakistani background, but she's British. And she was telling me all these times that she's felt vulnerable because she's brown. And I was telling her, I've felt intense fear, but because I'm a woman. And trying to unpack all these layers of intersectionality that appear, and that our fears, she's more vulnerable to violence because also of skin color. However, the fear that lives in us of this threat is the same. no? In the sense that how we act and conduct our lives to feel more protected, not walking by ourselves, replying or not replying when you get a cat call or a dude bothering you, or how do you context where you feel vulnerable. And it's so similar, no? It's just because it's fear. It's fear that teaches you to conduct your life because you know you're in danger in certain contexts. And that's powerful. And I'm going to go back to love with this, because how can you not love someone that you know feels like you? But once you see that in another person, it's like you have, it's way easier to love that person just as much as you love yourself. You see it, no? We're human. We're more connected than we're told. Our emotions are the same, are exactly the same.
So for the learning marathon that I'm on, I was really excited to do a workshop on restorative justice, which comes from Indigenous principles, actually. So as I understand it, the ideas around restorative justice were happening across different Indigenous cultures, whether it was First Nations in Canada, Maoris in New Zealand, and also Native American tribes in the US. But it's the idea that if someone has wronged you, if someone committed a crime against you, you have a restorative justice circle where you have the offender and the victim come together with other relevant people, whether it's loved ones, family members, social workers, religious leaders, everyone in the community who may or may not be connected to that person and want to be connected to the outcome of that discussion. And each person takes a chance to speak about what happened, and they unpack what's happened. And through that process of the victim saying, this is what happened to me after you did this, it creates empathy, and it facilitates a deeper understanding of how one's actions has affected someone. And from the research, it's found to be quite empowering in different areas, whether it's education, using it in schools when kids are texting in class. And it just seems like with having a circle of people of different ages, responsibilities, different roles, it creates this deeper understanding of morality and emotions and why people should conduct themselves for the better of the group. And it feels like we're in a position now in society where everyone's living in their own little bubble. Everyone's got their phone and their own network. There's this lack of communication between all these relevant people in our own communities, and it's leading to a lack of empathy. And if you have no empathy, there's not much you can go on to in terms of building things.
There's so much truth there. And in the sense that if we look back now to different cultures, the communities organize themselves in larger groups, no, and intergenerational groups. And yes, to build empathy, and also for respect of everyone's opinion, this acknowledgement of what you need to say is valid and you deserve to be listened to, just as much as you have to hear the rest, no? We've lost these practices. We've lost this respect, even within communities, for the elders, for the younger ones. Teenagers are now like the climate crisis ambassadors and revolutionaries.
Having to talk in the UN conference.
Exactly. It's like, excuse me, we as adults are failing humankind. No, we're really not doing what we should as a community. Through sharing, you create empathy because you understand better what another person needs and what that person is feeling. And if you're never exposed to listening to other people, it's like you don't learn that other people have inner worlds, that there's more inside. That's actually where my learning marathon also took me. I'm exploring how autobiographical narratives of liberation. So if you tell me your story of liberation, no, I wrote a poem, or I went to therapy, or I left home and moved somewhere else, or no, like if you explain to me how you felt it, how you thought about it, how it came from you, can that inspire me to unlearn? Can that inspire me to raise my awareness? Can that inspire me to liberate myself or use the resources I have for my own liberation, for our collective liberation? Because it's in that listening, no? That really listening, that change happens.
I'm absolutely fascinated by that idea. I want to read everything that you write about that. Wherever that goes. The stories we tell ourselves about our own identity is central to how we conduct ourselves in life, right? But yeah, to what you mentioned about this disconnect between generations, I discovered this new idea from Roman Krznaric. I think I've probably pronounced his name wrong, but he wrote a book called The Good Ancestor. And he wrote about the Maori concept of waka papa, which I was like, oh my gosh, I've never heard about this before. It sounds amazing. And it's this deeply embedded idea of, kind of imagine it like an image of all the generations linked together in arms throughout history, from past, present, future. Like everyone's connected in this link. And it's not just between people, it's also with the planet. So the idea of heritage, when we talk about heritage, we think about my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandmother. For waka papa, it's the earth before I was here. You know, it's like this idea of I am deeply connected in my ancestry, not only to the people who birthed me, but also to the planet and to animals and plants and everything, and how that also is not just connected to me in the present, because if it stops at the present, you're the most important thing, right? But it continues into the future. And I find that philosophy absolutely fascinating. And if anything, it is really what we need right now. What does home taste, smell, sound like?
Home is really noisy. Very, very noisy. There's people speaking over each other all the time. And there's cars honking. And it smells like a chifa, Chinese Peruvian food. Cooking on your wok some nice noodles or tipacay chicken. And the voices are in many languages now. It's not only in Spanish, since I've been living in English for the last 6 years. There's a mix in my head. And it still feels like I'm challenged all the time, but every time I'm more me, or I can belong a bit more. But I know I won't stop being challenged by everything and everyone from different perspectives, no? Like from different angles. But that's home.
What advice would you give to others who find themselves unsure of where they belong or how they fit in?
The first thing I would say is you're not alone. You're one step away from any human. I know it's extremely difficult in cities like this one, countries like this one, to reach out and to feel like you're being listened to, because it's so individualistic. But you're really not alone, because there's way more outside this individualistic Western view of the world. There's more. There's other cultures that are collective, that love you, that will love. There's cultures that already love humankind. What I would suggest is challenge yourself and your own narrative, and how you might be part of the single narrative, and you might think this is all there is, because that's what you were taught. But as Bob Marley would say, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, because that's what the single narrative is. It's just limiting us to see beyond and to see our connection as humans.
I couldn't agree more. That single narrative also connects to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, I think, her single story talk, which was very transformative for me many years ago. I'm so grateful that we could talk about these things. And if someone wants to follow you or see what work you're up to, where's the best place for them to find you? I
will start sharing more of the things I'm doing for my learning marathon on my Instagram account, which is at Valerie, VALERIEWV on Instagram, and on my Gmail, ValerieW@gmail.com. And I'm really happy to chat with anyone and talk further about this.
Valerie, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You've been listening to Zeno. To stay up to date with our monthly episodes, you can sign up to our newsletter at zenocast.org or follow us on Instagram at @Zeno_pod. Our theme music is composed by Alix Julian Edwards.